did not know what they were doing. 320 people died at once. 390 people were injured too. Outside of that, literally the whole city was obliterated. So those of y'all from the Bay Area who are of a certain age, you probably know a little about what I'm about to talk about. So let's do it. The Port Chicago disaster of the Bay Area, where 320 people were killed. Funny story, 320 servicemen were killed. Out of that, 202 were African American, and actually, they're estimated that at least 15% of the African Americans that died during World War II, they lost their lives in that situation. So let's talk about it. So when you go just north of Concord, east of Martinez, there's an area that is Port Chicago. What remains of Port Chicago. There's actually used to be a naval shipyard back in the day. It was very important during World War II. Those of y'all who are black who listened to my broadcast before, you know how I've talked about how the overwhelming majority of African Americans that came to the Bay Area, they came to Northern California, they came through service in the military, being working in those shipyards as a civilian or non-civilian. In this case, we're talking about those who were non-civilian. These were all Navy men. Most of them trained at this Navy camp spot they had in the Midwest. Their job, essentially, for the most part, of the laboral blacks that you have there who worked in the laboral positions, the enlisted men, we'll call them, was loading bombs onto ships, right? Now, when I say bombs, that includes bombs, torpedoes, depth charges, as well as fuel oils onto these ships. These ships, once they were done loading, would be sent to the Asian Pacific Theater. When I'm saying that, I'm talking about the Philippines or all the islands in the Asian Pacific where we're giving those weapons to them so we can go out and fight Japan, load them on the plane, you know, all that stuff, right? Bringing all this up because would you believe me if I told you that they had all of these boys, I hate to say boys, they had all these dang men on here uploading torpedoes, bombs, and fuel oils onto a boat, and none of them had any training in it? You not get what I'm saying. They were loading torpedoes, bombs, that you blow stuff up with on the ships day after day, all day, and had no formal training. They didn't know what they were doing. A lot of them just learned on the job how to maybe work the winches, and they were cool with it. This is how the Navy ran things. Add on to that, there was always a disconnect because you had a lot of black enlisted men and not a lot of black managerial people. What I mean by that, like I'll say black officers. For those who not know, if you're in the Navy, officer usually means that you're somebody of a higher rank, right? And there was always a disconnect because of that. Then you had some say that for the few black officers that you did have, or petty officers they called it, they really didn't listen to the concerns of the black enlisted men, who were those in the laboral position, the enlisted men. So bringing all this up because you have that, you're having a lack of training, you're having a disconnect in between the crew. There was some segregation. They did work in segregated units at the time, you know, white unit, black unit, whoop. Then one thing you had too was you had all these men who had no formal training, and these ignorant people had the nerve to have loading competitions in between shipyards. Loading competitions. Let me break it down what that means to you. The Port Chicago shipyard that I'm talking about right now, they had a loading competition in between them, their captain. I'm talking about the over captain. I ain't talking about in between the crews. The captain of that base had a loading competition in between that one and other shipyards about how much tonnage, how many explosives or cargoes they could load on per day, per rate, et cetera, right? And they will place bets upon that, which incentivized the soldiers to load stuff on the ship more faster, because they want to make some money, right? This puts a really dangerous atmosphere out there. And to be fair to the ILW, shout out to the longshoremen, they had the foresight that he was about to go on. They offered to train the soldiers and give them formal training on how to load them. It's like, bro, like, y'all loading tons and tons of explosives, bro. This is not going to go well, right? Navy didn't want to pay for that. They didn't want to encourage, they didn't want to get in, et cetera, right? So let's just get to the explosion. On the Liberty SSEA Bryant, this was being loaded one day in 1944. As you can guess, with all this is going on, an explosion took place. Mishandling of these equipments, as well as one of the winch operation of the winch device. The winches are kind of like those. I don't know how to explain a winch to you. I'll show you a photo of it right here. But that caused an explosion. Mishandling of that dropping, that was a cause explosion. And in one instance, 320 people were killed. 390 people that were in the nearby, because you remember Port Chicago was a city. 390 civilians were injured. God knows how much damage took place. This was an actual, genuine national tragedy. My condolences to those who have great grandfathers and great uncles who lost their lives in this. So now we get to the aftermath. And I'm speeding through this, but I just want to, because this is this is where it gets interesting. Despite the 320 that were killed, there were a lot of soldiers that did remain. Out of the 320 that were killed, 202 were African American. The Navy asked for Congress to pay $5,000, and $5,000 was a cool amount of money at the time, to each family of the Navy men that was killed, right? There was a representative and a politician in California, John E. Rankin, a Democrat. He actually was campaigning for that too. But when he found out that the overwhelming majority of soldiers that were killed in this were African American, you guessed it, said, hey, don't pay them $3,000. Don't pay them $5,000. Pay they just $2,000. He wanted them to get $2,000, wanted the white soldiers to get $5,000. Congress settled on $3,000 for each family, and so F. John E. Rankin, may he rest in peace. This is where we get to the aftermath of the story. So, in the aftermath of the story, those who were of the remaining soldiers, the remaining divisions, some of them helped build back the base, some helped repair the base, some helped, et cetera, et cetera. But literally like 2.5 weeks later, they got to get back to work. Oh, bro, we in World War II right now, bro. This is World War II. You got to take your black ass back to work. We at war. Japan's on our ass right now, as well as Germany. Y'all got to get back to work. So they were set up in different groups. Some groups were sent to different bases. This is when we get to the story of the mutiny that took place at Mare Island. Shout out to anybody who had family members that were employed at Mare Island. The Port Chicago Mutiny is what this is called. There was one big issue I have to add to that a lot of the black soldiers said that black enlisted men said that post the event, you got to remember, they're dealing with a lot. The explosion happened. Those of them survived. They lost a lot of friends that they knew. They weren't allowed any week or two of leave, but they said that a lot of the white enlisted men that requested leave were allowed to leave for like a month or so just to kind of get their mental space back together. So we get to Mare Island Naval Shipyard. They get there. They get to Mare Island, and a lot of them are still nervous. They send 300 and get my notes together. They sent 328 men to the Mare Island Shipyard to continue loading munitions on these ships because, we got to still keep the operation going. When they arrived there and they saw what they had to do, they said, F it, no, we're not doing it. The naval officers who were commanding at the time was like, what the F you talking about? It's like, no, bro, we not doing this. You want us to load these munitions on these ships in the same unsafe conditions that we were just doing, but we not doing it. We dealing with it, bro. I just saw 300 of my homies get killed, and that's what you talking about. So out of the 328, 70 were forced into working. They changed their mind and said, hey, we'll work, because the naval officers essentially said, hey, we not having that. Those in charge say, hey, we not having that. You gonna work or something bad about to happen to you. Okay, cool. The 258 that remained and said we're not working were sent to a brig, or essentially a temporary military prison, right? So they stayed in jail for a few days. One of the naval admirals with some soldiers took them and marched them out of the brig at a certain point, around the evening time or so. Took them out and said essentially, hey, this is what we finna do. You finna get your black ass out there and work in these barracks, work in these ships, and load this shit, because we need help. Our soldiers are over in Saipan, Japan, fighting right now. You finna load this shit, or you finna die in a shooting yard. This is just telling you just what he said. He said that, and then what ended up happening was, he said that, and then what happened was he gave an order to say, hey, we're gonna do this. Split this up into two groups, the 258 of them. Those of y'all who are going to serve your country and work and do what the fuck I tell you to do, you stand on one side. Those of y'all who want to die, stand on the other side. 250 out of that, you had 207 that stood on one side and said, hey, we're doing 208. He said, hey, we'll go work. and you have 50 who refused. That 50 ended up being called the Port Chicago 50. They were sentenced to 15 years in jail for mutiny, some of which served maybe a few years and got out, so like 2 years, and there were other ones who served a few more months, but none of them, from my understanding, served actually 15 years. To put a button on this topic, because I feel like I'm making this video too long, there was so many legal battles by the NAACP as well as others. Even Thurgood Marshall got involved in this to exonerate those men, to get them free. The Navy refused to sit on it. All these men who were charged with mutiny, as well as the 208 who did decide to work, but had bad conduct discharges, they all were exonerated in 2024. But it is something to be said about being too little too late, you know. It's funny because I was reading one of the interviews that this one guy had in 1991 who was one of the mutineers, and it was funny. He was saying that there was a fight even in the 90s for them to get exonerated back then, but his argument was like, I don't care about getting exonerated because I don't feel like I did anything wrong in the context of the time. So it's an interesting story.